Hello, everyone. This is Rhett Power from the Power Lunch on LinkedIn Live. I'm your host. We do this show every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. This is a special edition of my LinkedIn Live show. And so this is not quite going to be on the same time frame, but that's okay. In this program, we talk to today's thought leaders, CEOs, best-selling authors, people who are doing good stuff in the world and who can teach us and who we can learn from. The fun part of this show is that it's interactive. This one is going to be recorded, so it won't be interactive, but we will certainly get to your questions on LinkedIn and on the other platforms, because it is, as you know, it's simulcast on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn all at the same time. So it's a lot of fun. If you like the program, give it a like or share and spread the word about it. Our thing here is that we try to learn from the best, and today is no different. I've got Rory Sutherland. Now, this is somebody I've been wanting to talk to for quite some time. He is the executive director or creative director at Ogilvy One. He's vice chairman of the Ogilvy Group in the UK. For those of you who don't know, the Ogilvy Group is one of the larger, one of the best advertising and marketing firms in the world. His TED Talk has been seen by 7 or 8 million people now, which is just absolutely incredible. And you should go over and watch his TED Talk if you haven't. He's really regarded as one of the marketing and advertising's most original thinkers. And his new book, Alchemy, is a must read. And I got to say, Rory, before I let you speak, this book was original. It was funny. It was wise. It was a little irreverent. And it was most all, it was refreshing to me. And so Rory Sutherland, thank you for joining me on the show.
It's a great pleasure to be on. I'm coming to you actually from the south of France. I'm just being recorded. I'm attending the Cannes Advertising Festival. And it's a very, very interesting challenge writing a book about advertising, because there's a very, very good axiom, which I broadly stick to, which is that the best books about advertising aren't about advertising. So if you're going to write a book about advertising, don't write a book about advertising. And so I deliberately made this fairly oblique. I mean, partly out of sheer greed, in that I didn't want to confine the readership to people who work in one industry.
Right.
But also, I think the wider question of understanding the importance of marketing and understanding the fact that the way humans have evolved is not to pay attention to things proportionately. We don't have a great sense of proportion. What we notice and how we perceive the world has been essentially driven by evolutionary survival needs, rather than anything to do with the need for accuracy or objectivity. And this raises a really important philosophical question, which is, and actually, funnily enough, one which the ancient Greeks understood when they designed the Parthenon. If you measure the Parthenon using any sophisticated instruments, you realize that there's barely a straight line in the whole building. The pillars curve outwards in the middle. The floor actually bows upwards. And the sides bend. And the reason was, it wasn't designed for reality, it was designed for perception.
Right.
And it was designed not to be straight, but to look straight. And by the way, a modern equivalent of this would be the television. It's not designed to represent reality. That would be almost impossible, because you'd have to generate 1 billion colors. And a television that needed 1 billion pixels rather than 3 wouldn't be a great TV. So the way the TV works is it's designed around how the human eye works and how human vision works, which is our eyes only really detect the relative strength of 3 colors, red, green, and blue. And we extrapolate the rest of the spectrum.
Really? Okay.
And we extrapolate the rest of the spectrum from the relative strength of those three stimuli. So a television, in a sense, hacks us. It generates three colors, and from the relative strength of the three colors, we don't actually need to see yellow, simply because equal amounts of red and green are indistinguishable to our visual perception from yellow. Now, the reason I make these points, and I think one chapter is actually called "How to Buy a TV for Your Pet Monkey." The point being that TVs are specifically designed for higher primate vision. Your dog thinks your television is rubbish. If you've got a pet parrot, or for that matter, some sort of pet insect, the picture it sees on the television is entirely unrealistic. Now, the point about this is, if we allow the world to be designed by engineers and economists, which is around objective scientific measures, as though those were the things that humans cared about, we'll end up ultimately misdirecting just as much effort as if we were to try and make a television represent reality. The things that are important to actually generate are things that people notice and care about. And if you want to change behavior, this is a really important point, our vision is huge, our perception is hugely context sensitive.
Right.
So the same thing in a slightly different context can mean something absolutely different.
Yeah, right.
And so as a result, one of the questions you've always got to ask is, actually, if you want to change behavior or change the value of something, make something more valuable, more appreciated, more enjoyed, you can change the thing itself, although sometimes people might not even notice, by the way. Or if you change the story you tell about it, the context you present it in. Now, the oldest ad trick that performed that is, in a way, perhaps one of the great magical advertising tricks, is to turn a weakness into a strength. Now,
Right.
you know, the wonderful example everybody knows is "we're number two, so we try harder." Now, being number two is generally a weakness in a category. No one would run ads saying "we're number two in rent-a-cars."
Yeah.
But if you add that extra little sentence, "so we try harder," the weakness becomes a perceived strength.
Right. Right. It's brilliant.
And so one of the things I discussed is Red Bull, which tastes revolting.
Oh, it's
Now,
awful.
if you were trying to compete with Coke, the first thing you'd say is, we need to produce a drink that at least tastes as nice as or nicer than Coke. But here's the weird thing. Now, the three huge disadvantages of Red Bull: it comes in a tiny can, it's really expensive, and it tastes weird. In the context of a soft drink, would be catastrophic. But in the context of a medicinal product, something that promises sort of psychotropic or performance-enhancing powers, weird taste is actually a benefit, not a weakness. You don't want your medicine to taste great. You know, if you went to an oncologist and he said, "I've got you this great blackcurrant flavor treatment," that isn't really what you want to hear. And so the human brain is intensely and acutely optimized. First of all, it detects contrast rather than absolutes.
Okay.
Secondly, it's inordinately context sensitive, in that the same thing in a different context can be, for example, if you give someone a present, in economic terms, that's a benefit. People like being given presents.
Sure.
On the other hand, if you return a present, that's not an economic act of generosity, that's an insult. And so the nuances around this are so strong, and the extent to which meaning and therefore emotion and therefore behavior is generated in the head as much as in the factory, really means that in everything from selling consumer goods all the way up to designing a political program or designing a tax system, if we don't have psychologists involved or even psychophysicists, we can, and we simply leave the matter to economists, we can get things very, very badly wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When you created the behavioral science practice within Ogilvy, was that accepted, or was it a hard push to get that done? Or was there this realization that, yes, this is a really brilliant move because this will help us make better decisions for our clients?
Generally, no, it was pretty welcome. I mean, I think over time, it's become even more welcome, simply because I think the advertising and marketing fraternity have lost the knack of speaking to anybody outside marketing and advertising. I think we use a vocabulary which is fine if you're talking to other marketers, and it's fine if you're talking to other advertising people. You know, if you want to talk about brand iconography, that's a perfectly healthy conversation between advertising practitioners. If you're talking to a finance director, he probably thinks you're batshit crazy.
Goes right.
You know, it goes right through him. Either he thinks, I mean, he could react again in one of two ways. Either he thinks these people are idiots and I'm not going to give them any money, or he thinks, if I get involved in this conversation, I don't understand the argument, so I might make a fool of myself, so I'm going to stay away.
Right.
Now, actually, neither of those is a particularly desirable outcome.
No.
If you want to convince someone, neither of those things is really a particularly satisfactory thing to do. And so I've long believed that behavioral science, I gave a talk, funnily enough, just yesterday at Cannes. And I made the point, if you look at very, very big admirer of Robert Cialdini, who's written various fantastic books, including the most recent Persuasion.
Right.
And he effectively embedded himself in sales forces. And he went to see what it was that salesmen used as techniques for persuasion. And of course, some of the techniques are completely different from one sector to another. He said that, he said in many cases, selling a photocopier is not like selling a car.
Right.
But there were certain recurring patterns that cropped up time and time again. Interestingly, as I commented when I met Robert, some of them are quite contradictory. So you can say, this is one of the great comments I make in my book is, strangely, in physics, the opposite of a good idea is wrong. In psychology, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. So in a weird way, there are two ways of selling things. You can either say, everybody owns one of these, so it must be great, or this thing is really rare and not many people know about it, so it must be great. And they're two utterly contradictory statements or claims, but weirdly, they're both persuasive if you frame them correctly.
Yeah.
And so one of the mistakes I think we make is when we try and make something scientific, we remember our high school maths or our high school physics, and we go, well, I know what a science is. Unlike an art subject where you can have lots of opinions, a science is where you have a single right answer.
Right. Concrete.
Now, actually, in complexity science, or in, for example, decision-making under uncertainty, that isn't true. You can have multiple good answers. And indeed, as I've said, the opposite of a good intervention can weirdly be also a good intervention.
Right.
It isn't Newtonian physics in that way. Anyway, but the interesting thing I mentioned in my talk, and Robert Cialdini, funnily enough, Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman's co-author, also said something similar, where he said, what Daniel and I do is we take the things that are already known by advertising executives and car salesmen, and we codify them in a recognizable kind of academic framework. Bob Cialdini undoubtedly did that when he went kind of embedded into a sales force. And the point I made is that before Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, long before, dog breeders, pigeon breeders, which is a thing in the UK, right. I just want to explain, you race them,
right.
And also horse breeders pretty much understood the principles of natural selection, but they understood it tacitly, and they hadn't codified it, and they hadn't devised a framework for it. I mean, one dog breeder said to Darwin, because Darwin realized this, Darwin, rather like Robert, an early Robert Cialdini, went and embedded himself in groups of people whose trade instinctively knew what was going on. And funnily enough, before Darwin, there was a guy called Patrick Matthew, who pretty much written down the theory of natural selection, but he put it into an appendix in a book on naval arboriculture. So he kind of knew it, but he didn't know the significance. Right. And my argument is that marketers are like that. A whole bunch of good creative people or good marketers instinctively know that, for example, as with Avis, often quite a good ad line contains a small negative. We're number two, so we try harder. Reassuringly expensive was a famous line for Stella Artois in the UK.
Right.
Marmite, you either love it or you hate it, and so on. And we instinctively know it, but what we've never done is codify it in a way that when it comes to a boardroom argument, we've got a body of corroborative work showing this constant pattern that can support our case.
Right.
And so my argument is that the ad industry needs to stop being Patrick Matthew and stop being dog breeders, valuable, to be honest, as the tacit knowledge is, and start codifying it so that you can win an argument here and there.
Right. What is, you talk about all that you've learned in sort of human decision making. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I suppose, is that people don't really know why they do the things they do. They've got a reason, but that's not the same as the real reason. I think J.P. Morgan said this.
Right. Yeah.
J.P. Morgan always said that I think every man has two reasons for doing what he does: a good reason and the real reason. And the example in the book is cleaning your teeth. We'd all say we clean our teeth to prevent cavities, maintain dental health, prevent decay, maintain gum health, all the kind of right approved answers. If you look at when people really clean their teeth, first thing in the morning, yes. Before a date, yes. Before they go to work, yes. After lunch, probably not. I might admit this, I don't always clean my teeth at the weekend. First thing in the morning, certainly. And what you realize is that the fear of bad breath is a much stronger driver in cleaning your teeth than the fear of dental decay.
No, it's right. You're right. Right.
The immediate and highly Darwinian fear of being grossly unattractive, by dint of either having leaves on your teeth or foul-smelling breath. And if you think about it, some evidence of that, to bear that out, is that 98% of toothpaste seems to be flavored with mint.
Well, I know that's
if it really were about dental health. So I think in lots and lots of things people do, there's the official reason, which is really a post-rationalization, or what David Ogilvy once called in a famous passage, an excuse. That's the excuse I give for doing the thing I really want to do anyway. And David Ogilvy actually suggested that one value of long copy advertising was that you sold a product emotionally, but the long copy contained an excuse that gave the person a license to explain to his friends why he'd done that particular thing. Because we can't answer to our friends with, it just felt right. And of course, I think one of the problems is that we fetishize reason. And actually, this is a tough one to take, but I'm not always sure that in decision-making, particularly in business, the decision that has the best reasons is necessarily the best decision. Now, what it is it's the decision that won't get you fired.
Right.
And so I would argue, I think, and I'm not alone in this actually, I think an inordinately large amount of business activity is really self-preservation presented as rigor. When we're going through all these processes of market research or whatever it may be, or quantification, or presenting a kind of, cost-benefit analysis, I think what's really happening is we're providing defensive material to prevent us getting fired in the event that something goes wrong. I don't think we're really making a better decision.
I wouldn't just. I wouldn't just.
And I think humans do. I mean, it's an interesting question. I joked to Gerd Gigerenzer, who's a fantastic guy. Read his book, by the way. I can recommend this. Risk Savvy. Risk Savvy. Very, very good book. Very, very good book to add to your list. And my hunch would be, if you had human organizations which just worked on trust and accepted that occasionally instinctive decisions are pretty good, but like all decisions, they occasionally go wrong. I think we could be working a 3-day week in most office jobs. It also raises really interesting questions about the role of the entrepreneur, which is the entrepreneur is in one wonderful, unique position, which is he doesn't have a boss to whom he has to justify himself.
Right.
And so he can act within reason if his investors aren't too hideous. He can act on instinct because defensive decision-making, as Gerd calls it, which is where we make a decision not to optimize the outcome, but to minimize the risk of blame. Yeah. Defensive decision-making applies less to entrepreneurs. I mean, it's very interesting that when IBM created the PC division, they deliberately stuck it in Boca Raton, Florida, which is a whole seaboard's length away from their headquarters.
Yeah.
The belief being that if you placed it 50 miles from headquarters, someone would have killed it.
No, but we're not conditioned. I don't know that we're conditioned as people to operate without that decision making that we're used to, right? But we're used to making decisions in that safe way.
Yeah, well, I think what happens is that, I mean, it's very interesting. You may have come across this quite often when agencies pitch. The procurement function gives the client what's called a sort of balanced agency evaluation scorecard.
Right.
And it says, okay, rate the competing agencies on strategy, chemistry, creative brilliance, rigor, pricing, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And they're supposed to write down weighted numbers in all these fields, and the agency that gets the highest mark wins.
Right.
Now, I've asked people involved in that process, and I've said to them after a drink or two, you never do that, do you? And they go, no, of course we don't. What do you do? I know what you do. You basically decide which agency you want to win, and you backfill the numbers so you get the results you want. And to a huge extent, I think that happens in a large amount of business decision making. You essentially take the decision instinctively, and then you get into management consultants to make the process look rigorous. And I think, it's really important. I mean, there's a really interesting theory. I mentioned this in the book. Two French anthropologists, I think Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. Their theory is that reason is a relatively late addition to the evolved human brain, and it isn't there for the purpose of affecting decisions at all. It's there to help us argue our case, defend ourselves, and to
justify, right?
And to debate.
Yeah.
So it's there as a social, it's there for its social value, not for its value in terms of the decisions we individually take. And it's very interesting. A great colleague of mine, I know a friend called Alex Batchelor, who is the marketing director of Royal Mail, which I suppose is one of the oldest companies in the world. It was 16th century it was founded. He interestingly, he remembers speaking to an audience of about 450 accountants. And he just said, okay, before you bought your last car, personally, for your own use, which of you did a cost-benefit analysis? And he said, about 5 hands came up, all attached to like the saddest people on the planet, And it is so interesting because the people who develop very, very sophisticated decision-making tools don't necessarily use them in their own personal lives.
I'd say that's pretty common, yeah.
And it's interesting also, I think, because in evolutionary terms, this is getting really nerdy, but there's a great guy called Ole Peters at the London Mathematical Laboratory. And he's a physicist by background. And there's a concept well established, I think, in physics and statistical mechanics called ergodicity. And in an ergodic environment, let's get this right. Yeah. In an ergodic environment, essentially there's no path dependency.
Right.
Now, the entire mathematical structure of conventional economics assumes no path dependency. So it assumes that utility is an additive function. And you can lose a bit, gain a bit, gain a bit, lose a bit. Doesn't really matter. Now, his argument is this patently isn't true. In evolutionary terms, we've got one body and we inhabit it through time.
Right.
The order of events not being down to us. Okay.
Right.
And so and time not being reversible.
Right.
And his argument is very simply that in such a non-ergodic environment, we don't actually want to maximize expected utility in the sense that economists understand. We also want to maximize our time average growth rate, which weirdly means reducing variance.
Okay.
And reducing variance is as important as maximizing expectation. Because if something's multiplicative, if you think about it, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is a bigger number than 1 times 3 times 1 times 3 times 1 times 3.
Right.
And so in evolutionary terms, what we're actually trying to do is not what economists think we should be trying to do. And so something like a brand, as this is where I stole from Ole and used it in my own field, is something like a brand isn't a guarantee of perfection, and we don't pay a premium for brands for that reason. But no brand could be a guarantee of perfection. you know, it would be impossible for any brand under all circumstances to all people to be the best thing you could buy.
Right.
You know, in fact, I mean, it's very interesting in the car industry, if you think about it. I mean, what a brand, you know, the car industry, of course, you know, as cars get better and better, they start making in one dimension, they get worse and worse in another. So there are always kind of trade-offs that have to be made.
Right.
And what a brand is a fairly reliable guarantee of non-shitness. So if Ford puts out a car, for the most part, Ford has much more to lose in terms of sunk cost from producing a shit car,
right.
and in terms of reputational damage than
right.
a manufacturer you've never heard of.
Right.
And so we use reputation and reputational fragility as a kind of proxy for quality control. Now, the interesting thing about this is suddenly this isn't irrational. As an economist would say, it's actually deeply intelligent. We're using highly astute second order intelligence instinctively and tacitly to make a better decision.
Right.
And I find that fascinating. You know, the fact that brands sprung up and evolved, you know, they weren't really created. No one planned them or thought them up in advance.
No.
Brands, you know, kind of like kangaroos, you know, they happened. There's a great phrase in evolutionary biology, which I always love, because it's both utterly banal and fantastically profound. And it's most things are the way they are because they got that way.
Yes.
It's both the most childish sentence in the world and also the most astute. I think it's just wonderful.
I think it's incredibly brilliant. I mean, just wow. I have to ask you, because I was fascinated by this. You talk about this is just such an off the wall thing to talk about. What can honeybees teach us about creating a sustainable business?
No, this is fascinating.
Some of this research you're doing is just remarkable.
So bee experts, when they plotted honeybees' response to the waggle dance, they were slightly baffled to discover that a certain percentage of bees or a certain percentage of bee journeys seemed to just completely ignore the information in the waggle dance. They just went off at random. And they thought, well, this is quite strange. So we've had 20 million years of bee evolution. And you'd think if you wanted to optimize short-term pollen and nectar collection, you'd have kind of bee compliance officers enforcing higher levels of compliance with the waggle dance. And then these people modeled it as a complex system and realized that because the bees exist in conditions of in an ever-changing environment, with a high degree of uncertainty. In other words, you could be doing fabulously recovering nectar from field 274, or whatever bees call it. And then suddenly a flock of cows comes in and eats all the flowers, and it's useless.
Right.
And they suddenly realized that bees have understood if it weren't for the rogue bees, the hive will get trapped in a local maximum and eventually starve to death.
Right.
It's a bit like why we have sex, by the way, which is, if you think about it in genetic terms, asexual reproduction is a really, really efficient way of replicating your genes.
Yeah.
And the point is, it is right up to the point where it isn't. And so what happens is, if you do have asexual reproduction, there's no genetic variation. The genes propagate fantastically until one illness wipes out the whole lot of them.
Right. Right.
And so you become, when you're all identical and you're not diversified, you're super vulnerable to just one kind of, unexpected event,
right.
Unplanned for event. And in the same way with bees, I think that's a really important business lesson, which is that the optimization of short-term profit, which has sort of sprung out of the shareholder value movement, in some ways fragilizes companies in a lot of ways. You've got to be, in other words, you've got to have these rogue bees there. And the rogue bees will have a very different ROI on a journey from the mainstream bees. I don't even know whether they are different bees, by the way. I can't tell the buggers apart. They might be the same bees making a different kind of journey. But the one journey is, okay, energy retrieved in the shape of nectar needs to exceed energy expended in collection. You know,
right.
That's a fairly mainstream sort of a P&L measure.
Right.
But the rogue bees, essentially, you look at completely differently. And you say, okay, 98% of these journeys is going to be either very inefficient or wasted. And we accept that because the 159th journey hits real pay dirt, and the discovery of a new source of nectar can have a payback over time once you've done so.
Evidentially, right.
Yeah. And I was weirdly having a debate on Twitter about this just this evening, which is one reason why mass media may be better than targeted media is, to be honest, most successful businesses got successful because of a high dosage of luck.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't necessarily mean, by the way, that you have to be lucky to be a reasonably successful business person, but to really capture the heights of the winner takes all effect, to be a McDonald's, an Uber, a Google. Okay. That's not just skill. There's going to be luck there.
There's
timing,
luck.
Of course.
Timing,
those guys,
right.
Clever as they are, they were lucky in their timing.
Right.
I think Bill Gates and Jobs were born within sort of 15 months of each other or something.
Yeah.
And the point being that, of course, had they been born 10 years earlier, they would have ended up working for IBM.
Right.
Had they been born 10 years later, they would have ended up working for each other.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
The interesting thing there with luck is, I think mass indiscriminate advertising, generally the upside gain to fame is higher than the downside risk. And the great thing about being indiscriminately famous is it hugely increases your chance of being lucky.
Yeah.
An example of this, the book came out today. Yesterday, I was asked to go on Chris Evans' breakfast show on Virgin Radio in the UK.
Right.
Now, he's a fantastic radio DJ. Now, my hunch is what happened is, as a result, the book went briefly, I think, into the Amazon top 10 in the UK. Overtaking both The Hungry Little Caterpillar and The Highway Code, which is something everybody who learns to read, everybody who learns to drive has to buy a copy of The Highway Code. So it tends to be one of the top sellers, you see. It's a bit like Mao's Little Red Book. You don't have much choice but to have a copy of that.
Congratulations.
And, exactly, yes. And the reason that happened, that will have as much effect on book sales as everything else put together. And probably what happened is a mate of Chris Evans's happened to notice the book somewhere. Okay.
Right.
Now, this wasn't something you planned for. If I had a strategy about how to sell the book, my strategy would be all about going to business fairs, going to marketing fairs, talking to the business. I never would have said, hey, let's just go mass and go on to a mass breakfast TV show. Interestingly, The same thing happened in the US with Glenn Beck. So I appeared on his show as well. Now, in both cases, those are basically an extraordinary fluke. They're incredibly fortunate. But they only happen if you're kind of indiscriminately out there. If I'd spent my entire time targeting the C-suite, okay, then Chris would never have got to hear about the book.
Right.
And so I think this is the case with so many things that actually, the great thing about being indiscriminately famous is just that it increases your chances of nice things happening. Now, the interesting thing is advertising, I suspect, never claims the credit for a lot of those nice things. In the same way that if you're a business-to-business advertiser, it always fascinates me because probably about 10% of the value of being a famous business-to-business brand is that when your chief executives ring somebody up, they return the call.
Yeah.
I'm just imagining this, okay, I don't know. If you're the chief executive of Pfizer, then, okay, you're going to have a bit of trouble, you're the chief executive of, say, GSK or whatever. You're going to have a bit of trouble getting hold of the president of the United States. You probably got to wait a couple of days for the prime minister in the UK and also to find out who it is. That's a different matter. Okay. But at the same time, you'll get your call returned. Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, the chief executive of Zog Pharmaceuticals, he can't get his calls returned by his own fucking dentist. Okay. So, things like that, which we never even factor in, I think are much more important. And the very value of advertising, we've obsessed about micro-targeting. But the things that actually make a huge difference are actually pieces of lucky accident that probably lie outside our original plan. I was talking to the guy who founded the wonderful Box.com in the States.
Yeah.
And he's a fantastic guy. He was running out of a garage, and then one day he just got picked up on on breakfast news. Some story, just for whatever reason, just picked him up. And from then on, the whole game changed. You know, he was there effectively, almost feeling shame out of running this business by boxing up toilet paper in a garage and getting UPS round to pick it up or whatever.
Oh, I mean, my business went from $50,000 a year to a $10 million business because of that kind of, random.
It is
a completely random person that we met, who said yes, right? And
so the 20% randomness thing, I'm probably 80% random, because most of the people in Ogilvy aren't random enough, in my view. You know, I'd almost, if I ran Ogilvy fully, I'd actually say, okay, 20% of your time is totally discretionary.
smart.
I'd love to see what happened. You know, I mean, I'm weirdly what you might call promiscuous in terms of accepting speaking invitations, which used to drive my colleagues crazy, because they go, "Where's Rory? He's speaking at an actuarial conference." And people go, "What the hell is he doing that for?" And my argument was always, look, if by some chance some actuary wants to do some advertising, we'll be the only people he's ever heard of. Right?
Nobody else is going to
If I go to an advertising conference, they know 47 different places they can get advertising done.
Right.
But also that element of, I think that whole business, I'm a huge believer in both serendipity and also in what you might call just opportunism.
Mm-hmm.
And you said the same thing. It was someone you met.
Right.
And probably, the meeting involved a degree of luck, in that you wouldn't have been seeking this person out at all, would you?
No.
Now,
not at all.
It's the most interesting. Now, I think this is really interesting because Nassim Taleb makes this point, and I think it's fascinating, which is a lot of people don't like capitalism because of that luck element. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They actually go, this is unfair because people are quite rich because they're lucky. Now, you can sort of create the conditions where you're more likely to be lucky.
Sure.
So it's not 100% luck. It's just unplanned shit. Okay.
Yeah, no, you can.
But Nassim makes the fantastic, it's a bit like Woody Allen's point that 98% of success is just showing up.
That's right.
But Nassim makes the fantastic point that if you had an economic system where lucky people weren't rewarded, the very fact that 80% of what happens is luck would mean you'd miss out on 80% of the value creation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about it, some guy, I love it when things happen. Red Bull is a fantastic case. Dyson, okay. To be honest, if Dyson had come to me and said, I think there's a market for a kind of $900 vacuum cleaner, I would go, this guy's crazy, okay? It's a distressed purchase. You only buy a vacuum cleaner when your old one breaks, or if you move out of rented accommodation, you've got to buy your own. Nobody was really thinking of paying anything more than, mid-market to mid-upper, sort of $400 maybe at a real pitch.
Tops, right.
Yeah, real tops. I mean, that really is tops. There were really, really good low-cost alternatives, like the Henry, and you probably don't know this, it's a very weird brand in the UK, which actually has eyes and the word Henry along the top, but is actually a pretty good vacuum cleaner. And the bizarre thing is that by some weird confluence of fortune, as of course gave rise to the origin of life, the origin of humanity, etc., he managed to hit on something which no sane person would have done through planning. Now, if you don't have that feedback mechanism where lucky people are rewarded and survive, then actually a huge amount of innovation. If we weren't allowed to use the scientific discoveries that have been discovered by luck, penicillin, okay, antibiotics, they're out of the window.
Yeah.
Actually, vaccination probably is, isn't it? That was kind of luck that milkmaids who got cowpox didn't get smallpox.
Right.
Okay. Microwave oven, luck. X-rays, I think, were luck. Radio was luck. Radar was definitely luck. because they happened to set up a radio signal and noticed that every time a ship crossed the channel, the noise went funny. Okay, so you know, I mean, if you actually couldn't use any of the inventions that were the product of luck, we'd be living in the Stone Age, basically. You know, we might have one or two planned inventions, but I mean,
everything's kind of done. Roy, what? One, I know we've got to wrap up because it's getting late. It's getting to be almost 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock your time. And what is one sort of thing that you would leave us from the book, and how do they find the book? Where can they get it?
So, I mean, it's available online and off. In the United States, it's got a slightly different title. In the UK, it's called Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. And in the US, it's got a slightly longer title about creating magic in brands, business, and life.
Right.
And the simple point is a very, very simple one, which is that if you believe in economics, if you believe in the laws of physics, quite rightly, if you model your idea of the world on systems like that, magic's impossible. You know, energy cannot be created or destroyed.
Right.
Economics did this thing. There's no such thing as a free lunch, which is the equivalent of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, that's sort of true, except it isn't really, because in psychology, a free lunch just tastes better than one you have to pay for yourself. Okay.
It does, yeah.
You know, so in psychology, you can create value out of nothing. You know, if you tell a different story, you can turn being number two from a weakness into a strength. I mean, this goes back, I think, you know, in Chaucer, which is what, I suppose, 14th century, okay? The phrase crops up time and time again, to make a virtue of necessity. And as a business, okay, in economics, the value of what you create is objectively determined by what it is. That's in standard economics. In Austrian school economics, I don't know if you're an American, so you're probably a bit of a fan of sort of von Mises and Schumpeter and Hayek. Now, the Austrian school, who I think are basically right here, they think that value is created in the head. It's not created in the factory. And therefore, you can create value as much by changing the context in which you sell a thing, the story about a thing, the presentation of something is as much responsible for the creation of economic value as a factory is.
Sure.
And so the great despair I have is because the world's dominated by highly rational people, if you don't believe in magic, you'll never find it and you'll never create it.
Yeah.
So the whole book is, in a weird way, I only learned this after I'd written it, the mirror image of a phrase I think that Roald Dahl said, that people who believe in magic always find it.
And right.
My great complaint is there's this huge creative opportunity cost, which is the result of everybody having to pretend they're rational in everything they do, which is if everybody spends their whole time essentially doing the thing that's most rational and treating the world like an economist does, then by not believing in magic, you'll never find it and you'll never stumble on it and you'll never create it.
You can't end a conversation any better than that. Thank you so much, Rory, for your time. Good luck.
It's been a pleasure, real joy. Thank you very much for interviewing me.
I am jealous that you're getting to spend the week in Cannes, and I hope you have a great time. But this is, I look forward to the book getting out there and you getting your message out there, because I think this is a really, really important. As I said before, I think it's really, really important. And thank you for joining us on Power Lunch Live. This has been a special.
Thank you for your support. Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
All right. And thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. Always a pleasure, and stay in touch too. Thanks ever so much.